Hi, everybody. I want you to remember the name Jeremiah Bartlett. I know that I'm going to. This is the first time I've presented anywhere in 20 years and had a municipal engineer get up and argue for 10-foot lanes. And that is amazing. Where is he? Thank you. You won't need me in a few years. You're experiencing my built-in obsolescence, which is fantastic. Thanks to Grow Smart Maine, thanks to CNU New England, and I'm here because of one person, Kara Wilbur. Thank you, Kara. Who you all know, so I don't need to say anything more. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm a New England boy. I grew up outside of Boston. I've lived in Miami. I've lived in Washington, where I've been for the last 11 years, and in 5 weeks I'm moving back to New England. I'm moving to Boston with my family to be near my parents, who are in that demographic that shouldn't be driving, but amazingly still is. And so I see this as a bit of an early touchdown for what I hope is perhaps for the first time, a more regional practice and not a national or international practice, because I have kids and I like to see them. And I'd love to do more stuff in this area. An area that I know very well. I do a lot of work in the South, like Victor Dover, who you'll be hearing. And let me just say, I'm here because of Kara, I'm here for you all, but I'm also here to hear Chuck Marone and Steve Mouzon and Victor Dover talk, because they are the best in the business, and you guys are very lucky that you've got them here as well today. So I do a lot of work in the South. They say in the South you should think fast and talk slow. Here in New England, I grew up thinking as fast as I could and talking very fast, and I got a lot to show you. And thinking that I was in New England, I loaded up my talk. I'll only need about 3 hours. Kara, is that okay? 3 hours? But actually, I can get it done in time, but I'm going to talk super fast, so forgive me. And if you don't catch some of it, first of all the data is in my book. And if you're taking notes, you won't remember as much as if you just are engaged in the moment. And also, the book doesn't have any pictures. The pictures are all here. So I really encourage you to watch and listen. And don't worry about the facts, because they're all available. Or just tweet at me and I'll get them to you. So this is a talk I give all over the place. I changed this part of it, but I also changed the more, because a lot of places don't deserve the more. A lot of places, we just say walkable, because they're starting with a very bad framework. Here, obviously, you get the more because there's already a lot of walkability here. There's also, as Jeremiah indicated, there's a lot of progressive thinking here and advancement here. So I'm sure a lot of the things I'm going to tell you, you already know, but I guarantee you don't know all of them. And I tell the folks, particularly those of you who've been in the trenches for a long time, who hear me speak, don't just think about what I'm saying, because you probably agree with it. Don't just think and nod your head, but think about the way that I'm presenting it, because hopefully, after 20 years or more of doing this, and Victor, you'll have the same experience with Victor, we've figured out the best ways to make these arguments. And so half of it is what I'm saying, but half of it is the reasoning process and the way to convince other people about it. So hopefully, A, I will convince you, but B, you can use this presentation and the information in it to convince other folks. So it's a talk I call The Walkable City. I give a couple talks. One is called How to Do It. That's the talk I'm going to give you today. The other one is called Why We Need It. You're not getting that talk today. It's a TED talk. You can get it easily on the TED website. So go there if you want it. But this talk, I'm presuming you're all here because you want your communities to be more walkable. Believe it or not, some places that's a battle that still has to be won. But presuming that that's your goal, we're going to talk about how to do it. And of course, I say the walkable city, but it could just as well be the walkable town. And the principles that I'm suggesting here, sure, some of the examples are more bigger cities, some are smaller places, some are villages, but it's the same principles at every scale and at every level of density. A little background on me: I had the good fortune after a decade at Duany Plater Zyberk of overseeing this program called the Mayor's Institute on City Design. Somewhere in America, every 2 months, we would gather up 8 designers and then 8 mayors. I would get to pick the designers. 8 mayors, organized by the US Conference of Mayors. We'd lock ourselves in a room for 2.5 days around a conference table. Each mayor would bring their most pressing urban design challenge. We'd argue through the issues, hopefully solve the questions. You know, how do I reconnect to my waterfront? Where do I put my convention center? But more importantly, I think we'd send the mayors home as design mayors who really cared about that aspect. And Mayor Riley, who helped create the program, here's a lesson for mayors. He's finishing up his 40th year as mayor of Charleston, South Carolina. That's right, 10 terms. He would say, you know, Mayor, no one's going to remember you if you balance the budget. But if you build a park, they'll remember you. And that was part of the lesson of this effort. But it allowed me, the things I learned from these mayors allowed me to reframe the argument. No longer around the term, you know, neo-traditional town planning, which turned off the liberals, or new urbanism, which turned off the conservatives, and just recognize that it was about something else. It was about good urban design, but who knows what that means? So we reframed it around the issue of walkability. And walkability, I believe, is the new term of art for describing what we're trying to accomplish in communities. I do a lot more work recently for a group called CEOs for Cities. CEOs for Cities is a nonprofit that cities pay a lot of money to come in and tell them how to compete. You know, what can we do to attract millennials? What can we do to attract corporations? How can we be the kind of city which is thriving? And they understand, the reason I get involved, they understand it's a two-part deal. That half of it is programming. What's the stuff? How big is my convention center? Right? What sports facilities do I have? What events like Art Prize can I have? Art Prize in Grand Rapids that changes the way that people interact with the city in a positive way. But the other half is just those simple everyday spaces between the buildings that either do or don't create street life or pedestrian culture, this environment that if you don't have it, you will not be a success in the 21st century. And it's about design. And my talk today is about design and about answering the question then, if walkable cities, if walkable places are thriving places, then how do you get people to walk? Which leads to what I call my general theory of walkability. It's not really my theory, it's a lot of stuff I learned from other new urbanists over many years. It's a theory in the sense that it's a hypothesis that's been kind of borne out and adjusted based on a lot of experimentation. It's a work in progress, but the best we've got it down to at this point, and it's the backbone of the book. I will be at the table over there signing books. So Kara said I had to come up with a fun contest for giving away a book. So what I've done is I've carefully, I have a perfect 1-yard pace. It comes in very handy in my business. Although I'm not warmed up and we're indoors. But I've done my best to pace out 30 feet, starting at 1 column. And the question is, if you walk along these columns 10 paces, how far are you from the column that you arrive at after 10 paces? And whoever gets the closest to my 1-yard pace gets a free book. Okay, moving on. So, there's the book. So it's the backbone of the organization of the book and the organization of our thinking on this matter. How do you get people to walk? Well, in America, where walking is so easy and so cheap. You're paying only a fraction of the cost of your driving. And that's not even considering the externalities beyond, you know, the indirect costs like pollution and time wasted. But just in sheer dollars, you're paying a fraction of what it costs to drive. So it's something that you do more than you would otherwise. 4/5 of the cost of driving is owning the car, and only 1/5 is driving the car. So every mile you drive costs less than the mile before. There's that incentive as well. And the car is often sitting between you and everything, right? In the driveway, right there. It's so easy to use it. Now, I'm all about creating pedestrians by choice. Now, it so happens that 30% of Americans can't drive. They're either too young, too old, you're not able to for some other way, or too poor to drive. And we need to make a society that works for a landscape that works for them. But we're only going to do so effectively, and we're only going to see public money going to it if we can create pedestrians by choice, get the other 70% to choose to walk. So in order to do that, the walk just has to be as good or better than the drive. And to do so, it has to satisfy 4 criteria, all of them at the same time. There has to be a reason to walk, it has to be a safe walk, it has to be a comfortable walk, and it has to be an interesting walk. And that's the structure of my talk today. We're going to begin with the reason to walk, which is the story of urbanism, the story of planning. These are my mentors, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg. Half of what I'm telling you I learned directly from them. They are really the progenitors of this movement. And if you recognize some of the slides from Andres 20 years ago, well, that's true. So one of Andres' great talks was called The Story of Planning, and he describes how, back in the 19th century when people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, I say in a mill, and the planners who were not planners at the time said, hey, let's separate the housing from the factories. And lifespans increased immediately and dramatically, and we like to say that experiencing that great victory, planners have been trying to repeat it ever since. So the onset of what's called Euclidean zoning, the separation of the landscape into large areas of single use. And I should say almost my entire talk is about existing older places, but this is the brief part of the talk that's about creating new places, which is still happening in America. Certainly in New England, in the suburbs outside of Portland, we are developing new land. And it so happens that even though we planners all know this is wrong, and the leadership knows it's wrong, most of the time when I or Steve Mouzon or Victor Dover land at a site to do a plan, there's already a plan on the site, and the plan looks like this. And all the plan says is that housing will be separated, single-family housing will be separated from multifamily housing, and separated from office, and office will be separated from medical office, which will be separated from retail. And it's impossible to get people to walk because the walk of any distance isn't useful. So I was an art history major. People say that has limited value, but I can tell you, you don't want a Rothko, you want a Syrah. Syrah was the pointillist, right? And the most walkable places are the places that have the finest grain mix of uses, and this map of Manhattan is even a little misleading because the red is vertically mixed use. So the smaller grain, or don't zone by use at all, right? Rule out certain, and this is the whole point of the new urbanist form-based codes, rule out certain noxious uses, but then don't organize by use. But if you're gonna organize by use, then do it with the finest, pointiest pencil, so that the walk in short distance is useful. And this is not about mobility, then it's about accessibility. What can we do not to help people move more, but to allow them to move less? Which leads into the great story of the new urbanism, which one person in this room hasn't heard yet. So for them, raise your hand, I have to give it to them, which is the classic discussion of town versus sprawl. And that the fact is there are only two tested ways to build community in the world. One is the traditional neighborhood, and the other is suburban sprawl. And the traditional neighborhood is defined as being compact, by being diverse, and by being walkable. These are a few different neighborhoods of Newburyport, Massachusetts. You can see in very short distance you have places to live, places to work, places to worship, places to shop, places to recreate, places to go to school. Most of your daily needs are within walking distance, so it's diverse in use. It is compact in that most traditional neighborhoods, if you map them, are a 5-minute walk from edge to center. As Steve Mouzon argued brilliantly last night, people will walk many different distances, but the 5-minute measure, the half-mile across, is still something you find looking historically and across cultures throughout, since 10,000 years ago when we had our first non-nomadic settlements like Jericho, right? You find that 5-minute walk measure. And it's still a useful measure. Andres likes to say, it's the distance at which you feel dumb driving. So it's a good measure to use. And then it's walkable because there's a porous network of streets. Many streets, and so no one street needs to be that big. And I'll be getting into that in great length. Sprawl is defined in the opposite way as not being compact, thus the name, not being diverse. Whole square miles contain the same use and often just the same house, repeated over and over again. And it's not walkable because so few of the trips, so few of the roads actually go anywhere that those ones that do become overtaxed, overwide, and noxious. The houses turn their backs to them, and you can see that's what we call a traffic sewer. And you have the phenomenon of the cul-de-sac kid, who's this kid who's perfectly content and safe and happy in his or her cul-de-sac until they're about 7 years old. And they get really bored, And as a parent, you want them to have some independence. You give them an allowance and say, here's $5, spend it on anything you want. And they say, great, can I have a ride to the mall? Because they're utterly dependent on the parents to get anywhere. So it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts, something that we've been doing now in these discussions for about 30 years, talking about the places where you only live, where you only work, where you only shop. The aerial photographer Alex McLean, by the way, who's a Harvard-trained architect, who took most of these pictures. Supersized civic institutions, the school that for the pride of the school board or the convenience of the janitorial staff gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and therefore further and further and further away. I'm working in Lowell, Mass, where there's still a move afoot to move the high school out of downtown to the edge of downtown because they want some big new, I guess, completely unwalkable facility. There's this trend towards bigger and thus further away because you're serving a larger area. And the ratio of the size of the parking lot to the size of the school tells you all you need to know about this school, which is that no child has ever walked to this school, no child ever will walk to this school. The seniors and the juniors are driving the freshmen and the sophomores, and we have the death rates to prove it. I saw this flying over South Florida. This is Weston, whose billboard slogan was the feeling of a small town. That's changed, I think. But they're very proud of their 8 soccer fields and their 8 baseball diamonds and all of that. But look at this. When I grew up, I had 1 soccer field, 2 tennis courts, 1 baseball diamond. But I could walk to it because it was in my neighborhood. When you supersize, you separate. And then, of course, it's at the end of this long arterial road, the traffic sewer that no parent would ever let their kid on. And this is why we have the soccer mom in America. Imagine living in this house and sending your kid to play baseball. And actually, you can't send your kid to play baseball. You've got to drive them about a mile to play baseball. So the one part everyone forgot to count, if we separate everything from everything else and reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then our federal highway system, which was created for commerce and for pleasure travel, becomes a commuting system. And the money we spend on it, so I always tell people it's a 2-part deal. This is the American dream for many, although the latest surveys tell you it's only about 10%. But this is the historical American dream. But you can have this with that, and not without it, because it's all part of the same alternate system, the system that's the opposite of how older parts of the country like this grew over centuries. So we spend inordinate amounts of money making sure the car never has to wait an extra light cycle at any given intersection, starving our civic institutions of capital in order to build this. And does it make life any better? The experience of being in these places is not enhanced. This is not Photoshop. Walter Coolidge took this picture, a traffic engineer. So the experience of being a driver isn't very good either. Being a pedestrian can be even worse. And then there's the whole health discussion, which is so important. And the epidemiologists have been showing this slide for 15 years. Dick Jackson, Howie Frumkin, I got this slide from Howie Frumkin, he's a doctor. And what these doctors are telling us in an amazing book called Urban Sprawl and Public Health, what they're telling us is, actually, if you think it's normal to drive, to park, to take the escalator, to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, then there's something wrong with our society. And we have the first generation of Americans ever who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents because we've engineered out of existence the useful walk in our country. This one's flawed because housing is missing, but housing should be a part of this drawing too. To point out is the same stuff, but it's a question of scale and it's a question of network. How big is it? Is it integrated? And what's the street network? Because the great irony of sprawl is that this system, which was designed entirely around the automobile, and by the way, this evolved naturally in response to man's needs. This was invented. But the system that was invented entirely around the automobile actually functions worse around the automobile because every trip needs to take that one collector road. And God help you if there's an engine fire on that one road. The whole system just shuts down. And it can't grow. We like to joke that sprawl is the one place where you can have the traffic of a metropolis and the culture of a cowtown, because it can't grow up without choking on traffic. In the network, of course, there's 10 ways to get from any one point to any other point. So it works better for walking and for driving. Now, what about existing places? I'm done talking about new places. What about existing cities? Then, in terms of the useful walk, you just have to ask the question, what uses are missing or underrepresented? And this is a discussion we're not going to have, but the places where walkability is the most possible in your city is in the commercial areas or the mixed-use areas. In the heart of your city or town, in the main street or in the downtown. Or if you have other little mixed-use areas, main streets within your community that grew up over time as mixed-use. This is where walkability is most likely, and these are the sort of environments I'm talking about, because it's very, very hard to add mixed use to a residential area. It's much easier to add housing, which is typically the underrepresented use, to a commercial area. If you don't believe me, go into a housing subdivision with a 7-Eleven and see what happens to you, right? But it's very easy to add housing to where it's missing, and in American downtowns, housing is typically the underrepresented thing. I worked in Boise, Idaho. The jobs to housing ratio downtown there is 43-1. That's not so unusual, and it's why the sidewalks roll up at 5 p.m. So when you bring the housing back, of course, the other stuff starts to kick in and get better and better. The housing comes first. Eventually, the schools, like 15 years later, the schools get better. Because the risk-oblivious millennials have to move in, and then get older, then have kids, and then fight for 10 years, and then you get better schools. But it's a process that takes time. And then another question, because who knows when I'll address you all again. I'm going to spend 5 minutes to you talking about a use that's underpriced and therefore overrepresented. And in most downtowns, that's parking. This is where I have to evoke the image of, who knows who this is besides the ringers here. Don Shoup, the god of American parking. The first person who asked the right question about parking in this country, which isn't how can we have enough of it, but how can we provide it, design it, and manage it in a way that will cause cities to thrive. There's a Facebook group called the Shoupistas. He's a very talented guy. And what he's figured out after studying parking for, 70 years, is that he has this 3-legged stool. The first leg, and this pertains, you'll understand who it pertains to. Places where you have perceptions of a parking problem. And if you don't have perceptions of a parking problem, then you don't have to listen to the next 4 minutes. 3-legged stool, first leg is just get rid of your on-site parking requirements, your building by building on-site parking requirements, which do things like here in Detroit, turn an opera house into a parking lot. The on-site parking requirement is the single greatest destroyer of walkability in American cities, because it puts people right at their destination. There's no reason to use the sidewalk. The parking lot is often in front of the building, or the first 5 stories of the building. And it causes a lot of great stuff not to happen, because parking requirements for different uses kick in to different or often larger amounts of parking. Like, oh, I want to provide sidewalk dining. Oh, then you need to provide 5 more parking spaces. Oh, well, I don't have those spaces, so no sidewalk dining. But getting rid of the on-site parking requirement doesn't mean that you get rid of parking requirements necessarily, or that you don't provide enough parking. But parking needs to be addressed cumulatively, municipally, as a public good. And actually, when you manage it right and consolidate it, you end up with anchors. Parking lots become anchors in your downtown, as opposed to inducements to drive. The second leg of the stool is to price parking right. And this is Shoup's main point, and what most cities are very reluctant to do, which is, if necessary, if you have parking crowding, do a very simple parking plan, like this early one for Redwood City, California, which essentially says we're going to charge more for parking where people want to be more, and less where they want to be less, with a simple goal of 1 empty space per curb face throughout your city. Because like any good, if you price it according to its value, the market can function properly. And cities refuse to do this, and so there are impressions of scarcity of parking in most downtowns, when in fact, there's a ton of parking, it's just not in that main place where people want to be. Meanwhile, Daddy Warbucks cannot find a spot in front of the Furrier, so he goes to the mall, right? You want to have people with more money to spend able to find that spot that costs more to occupy. The parking meter was invented by merchants for merchants, and it just had its 100-year anniversary. And That's very hard to convince the merchants, to remind the merchants to do. Merchants hate to see you charging more for parking because they think it's going to hurt their business because they don't study the history of the parking meter and what it has done. And fortunately, Don Shoup has. And what he found is that as you charge more for parking so that it can behave according to the market, stores' revenues go up considerably. So the third leg of his stool, which is what he has to use often, like in Pasadena, where this says your meter money makes a difference in old Pasadena, is the parking benefits district. Merchants, we're going to take every extra dollar that we earn by charging the right price for parking in your community, and we're going to put it into your storefronts, your sidewalk, your trees, into your back alleys. These used to be the back alleys of Pasadena. And your place is going to get better and better and better. And you're going to make more money, and we're going to make more money on the parking, because people will pay more to park. It's a virtuous circle that when cities do it, the next day after the merchants are defeated, they come up to you and say, I was sorry, thank you, I'm making a lot more money now. So that's the basic Shoup rule. This is the first place I've ever been. This is Bar Harbor. I love this name, the All-American Road. Someone had to have it. That actually tells you this is a parking spot. I didn't know that. But the reason that's here is it's actually a larger sentence, 2-hour parking. 2-hour parking is one way to get the churn, but it's nowhere near as effective as actually charging the right price for parking. So that's the useful walk. There are other categories I don't have time to tell you that have to do with transit and other things, but that's the heart of it is mix the uses and then manage parking properly. The safe walk is what most walkability experts talk about. It is absolutely necessary and not alone sufficient to create a walking society, but it is the heart of the matter when it comes to what we need to talk about. And there are about 100 different moving parts that determine whether your walk in your downtown is safe. The first is block size. This is Portland. The other Portland, have you heard of Portland, Oregon? It's somewhere over there. Portlandia. Famously 200-foot blocks, famously walkable. This is Salt Lake City, famously 600-foot blocks, famously unwalkable. Here they are side by side. Completely different. When you have a 200-foot block city, you can have a basically 2-lane city with a few exceptions. But a 600-foot block city is a 6-lane city, which is why in Salt Lake City they give you the orange flags at some of the intersections. They give you orange flags in a basket that you're supposed to hold up as you cross the street. Because that's what big blocks require if you're going to move cars around at all. Here's a study of 24 California cities. As the block size doubles, the number of non-highway fatalities almost quadruples. So clearly an inverse relationship. The smaller the blocks, the safer you are as a pedestrian. It's fun. This is the first talk I've given ever where we have some blocks that are smaller than Portland's. And the reason is that I'm in New England, where a lot of cities were laid out in almost the medieval era, or so it would seem. These little cow path streets, these aren't them, but you can see in Lewiston where we are, you essentially have a 200-foot by a little bit longer block, right? 200 feet by maybe 500 feet. It's a little bit later than some of the other places, like Portland, where you have some blocks that are actually less than 200 feet by about 200 feet, so bravo for that. Here's Portland and Portland. I finally get to do that. And the right one's on the west and the right one's on the east. But you can see the much more characteristic and interesting New England medieval grid next to the checkerboard grid of Portland, and how you have some really tiny blocks. And of course, this is the most walkable part of Portland, Maine, because it's got those smallest blocks. Here's Bangor. This is another part of Portland. This is the more Lewiston part of Portland. This is the more typical, where you have the blocks that are about 200 by 400. It's a great measure. And then this is Bangor, which has nice small blocks and that lovely cranky grid. The heart of it, of course, is the most walkable part. And then there's the other models, and I could have picked on anyone, but this is Westford, but it could be 100 other places, or at least many other places in Maine that were just developed later and not along that network model. So as you grow, you're growing on the sprawl model, on the big block model, on the dendritic branching model, as opposed to the network model. So of course it's a vehicular place more than a pedestrian place. Next is just the number of lanes. This is a conversation that many of you know, but it's a conversation I always have in every place I go because it's so important. It refers both to highways and to city streets, and it's this concept of induced demand. Something I learned from traffic engineers, progressive traffic engineers, but they were progressive 20 years ago. And now this is becoming better known, that we widen streets. We widen streets in order to absorb anticipated capacity, thinking it will solve our traffic problem. But it doesn't solve our traffic problem because there's something called latent trips. This only applies to congested systems. In congested systems, the principal constraint to driving is congestion. That's all you need to know. Because the principal constraint to driving is congestion, that when you widen the street and widen the street, people make different choices. They move further away from their job. They stop carpooling. They begin commuting more in peak hours. They don't take transit. And these choices represent latent trips that fill up the new roads almost as quickly as you can build them. This is from Newsweek magazine, hardly an esoteric publication. Today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. And when I read this, I jumped up for joy. Hooray, Newsweek magazine, and then I landed and said, well, can I meet some of these engineers, please? But in fact, I've been working for them. I've been working with them. Sometimes it seemed like for them. But I've been working with them for 20 years because this is something that's been slowly bubbling up from the bottom of the traffic engineering profession, that now it's understood at the top of the traffic engineering profession. But still, most places I go have an internal traffic engineer who, even though he or she will tell you that they understand induced demand, they're every day making choices as if they don't. And they're principally making those choices because the public doesn't understand induced demand. And at least half the public, probably more, thinks that you can solve a traffic crunch by adding lanes. And so you add that extra lane because they tell you the traffic's coming, and then the traffic comes and they say, see, I told you we needed it. But in fact, it was the traffic that generated the lane. Here's the study presented at the Paris School of Economics. I have no idea what this means, but I do know what this means. And what this means is that within a few weeks of building the new facility, the widened facility, 40% of the capacity is taken up by new trips, and within 4 years, 100% of it is taken up by new trips. You can spend a lot of money. This data is from the 90s, comparing those places in the US that spent more money to fight traffic by adding lanes with those who didn't, from the Ice-T effort that you may have heard of. And they found, we spent what certain places did by spending a total of $22 billion more than those that didn't, is to lengthen commute times. That's what you accomplish by widening roads, is you make commutes longer. This is 2 weeks ago. You heard about the Carmageddons that were happening in LA as they were widening the 405? So they spent how many million? They spent $1 billion and had 2 shutdowns of this highway in order to add some lanes, and on the day it opened, commute times went down. Commute times went up by a minute. And so actually all this investment that was done entirely to fight congestion made congestion a little bit worse immediately. It didn't take 4 years because it's Los Angeles. So when I see a street like this in Bangor, an intersection like this in Bangor, and because you're in New England and your space is constricted, you don't see this problem to the same degree you see it elsewhere in the country. But when you look and you see an intersection like this in Bangor, which has 6 lanes, meaning 5 lanes, there's a simple question which I ask, which is show me the counts. Because some of them may be congested. Now we're moving beyond, oh, by the way, I make this induced demand argument everywhere I go, and then I give up because it's unwinnable. Now it might be winnable, locally, at the larger state level it's unwinnable, and usually it's the state or the federal government that's paying for these roads. So then I move on, and I say there are places in every city where well, this is less the case in New England, but there are many places in Maine where the capacity is greater than the demand. Because they're just not that busy, or at some point they were oversized. So we're moving beyond the induced demand argument and saying, are there places that could be safer and more walkable by having fewer lanes? And the investigations that I do wherever I go is to compare the number of lanes, which implies a number of trips, to the actual number of trips. And if the counts on this intersection are 6 times 650 per peak hour, then we've got a political battle ahead of us. But if they're less than that, then you can say to the public, we can remove a lane or two and actually not reduce your commute times because you're not using it fully. So once you've made the induced demand argument and you've moved on, then you need to look for places with excess capacity. And I'm guaranteeing you that some of you do have them. Next is one-way streets. Probably a more relevant and actionable item than the number of lanes that you have here. One-way streets do not feel safe for pedestrians because of this great mass of vehicles, this momentum of all these vehicles going in the same direction. They also encourage speeding. There's no opposing traffic coming at you, but most importantly, there's that other lane. And I'm referring only now to multi-lane one-way streets. And typically it's two-way streets that were then converted in the 60s through the 80s to one-way streets, giving you that extra lane, which allows you to jockey. And that capacity to jockey, the knowledge that you're in a lane and there's another lane, and God knows that other lane is the faster lane because you're not in it, right? That makes you a different kind of driver. It turns you from sitting behind the car in front of you quite comfortably and happily to looking for the fastest way out of town. And so they're bad for safety, they're also bad for business. This is the keystone argument, the keystone article in this discussion. It was published in Governing Magazine a number of years ago called The Return of the Two-Way Street, and it pointed out one particular example of Vancouver, Washington, where they tried every trick of the 80s to bring back their Main Street. You know, the 6 Bs, the bricks, the berms, the banners, the bollards, the balloons, the bandstands, and nothing was working. And finally, they got permission to make it a two-way street again, and in so doing, according to the merchants, their revenue doubled almost immediately. There are other examples. East Broad Street in Savannah was converted to one-way in 1969. Christian Sotil did the research and found that over time, not that long of a time, 64% of the tax-paying businesses disappeared from that street. And then in 1990, it was reverted to two-way, and pretty quickly there was a 50% gain in businesses. Merchants just do better on two-way streets. This is Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where I've been working, and I'm working for the Public Works Department with the engineers to revert their system from half one-way, and all 4-lane, by the way, but half one-way, back to all two-way. And I always say, you know, they were going to spend $3 million to rebuild one street. And I said, well, for half that money, we can restripe your entire downtown, your entire 25-block downtown grid, for less money than you were going to spend on that one street, and make the whole place safer and more successful. And so we're going from this to this, okay? Reducing the lanes to the number that traffic demands. That's why I say, show me the counts. We're going from this in terms of the amount of parking with parallel orange and angle red to this. And we're going from this bike network, where the green one is a rail trail, to this bike network. And we'll be doing it with just standard Public Works dollars over the next 5 years as they repave streets, as they always do. This is Lowell, Massachusetts, 4 years more from principally one-way back to two-way. And with the intersecting grids, with the canals and the rivers, this was a complete nightmare. It was one of the first. It was done in the 50s. And we have reverted it 4 years later. They did nothing for 4 years, and then 4 years later they did it all at once, without a hitch. So I went back on a rainy day, so the after's gonna look worse. But we went from this, Merrimack Street, to this, okay? We went from this, Market Street, a total speedway, to this, and another street, I forget the name, from this, Central Street, from this to this. And it's come off without a hitch, and the merchants are already experiencing, some of them, they're a little cagey, but they seem to, no one's unhappy. And it's wonderful to see it happening in such a cranky, narrow New England grid. So here is Lewiston, and you've got this kind of quadrumvirate, what's the word? You've got 4 streets, Park, Lisbon, Pine, and Ash. That's this one-way kind of turbine going on. But not all of them are multi-lane. Certainly Park Street could be a 2-way, and it would function beautifully as a 2-way. Other ones like Lewiston, I caught you with your pants down here. You were restriping Ash Street brilliantly to include the bike lanes. So sometimes leaving a street one way makes sense in order to insert a bicycle facility. So it isn't always the thing to do. Central Street in Bangor is certainly a street that looks like it could take a reversion right away. But then you have like Rockland's Main Street that by all accounts is doing very well. So the message here isn't to immediately revert all your one-ways to 2-way. The message is, if you have a one-way street and it feels unsafe, or your merchants could be doing better, then probably it's worth a look. But you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But most of these are, I would say that this street is broke, or at least broken. So think about this in this article. Then here's a little gift to Auburn. This is the classic American road diet. This is the win-win-win that the engineers taught me about 10 years ago, where you take the 4-lane street, super dangerous, and you convert it to a 3-lane street by creating a continuous center turn lane, which, by the way, when you don't need to turn, can be a median with trees in it or something else pretty. And you gain room, as Jeremy discussed, you gain room for bike lanes or parking or something else when you make that change. This doesn't surprise anybody that the accidents drop precipitously. But the surprise is this. These are 17 different road diets charted by AECOM, the engineering firm. Look at the number of trips per day before and after. On average, it went up slightly. So because of the great inefficiency of the 4-lane street, in addition to the danger, it's actually not a sacrifice in capacity at all. So you get as much capacity, you gain a bike lanes or parking lanes, and you save lives. So here's Court Street that I learned about last night in Auburn. It's a perfect example of the sort of 4-lane street that could be a 3-laner tomorrow and gain parking lanes and or bike lanes, okay? Next is the width of the lanes. My favorite subject, which you heard a little bit about right before me. This is the slide Andres used to show and say, the typical road to the typical subdivision in America allows you to experience the curvature of the earth. And, there's been this mission creep. So here's a subdivision from the 60s, and here's a subdivision from the 80s. And look at how the streets are, same height. Look what's happened to the streets. Because the standards have just, test, do I have to turn it on?
That one's on.
Yeah. The standards have just changed. So we go from this to this. My old neighborhood in South Beach in Miami, Espanola Way, the street wasn't draining properly. So they had to rebuild the curbs, and the new standard kicks in, so we lose half of our sidewalk. And no one questions that. People go faster on wider streets. Increased lane lists are responsible for approximately 900 additional traffic fatalities per year. How long do we have to say this before people start acting on it? And, Portland may have 10-foot lanes, but everywhere I go, I'm fighting against the 12-foot standard. Fighting for 10-foot lanes against people who insist that 12-foot lanes are safer when we know they're not. Citizens know they're not. Citizens are always fighting for narrower streets. Portland, the other Portland, instituted a skinny streets program, and then we worked with the developer Vince Graham, who built this town with Dover Cole and Dwani Plater-Zyberg, built this community, Ion, outside of Charleston, and he goes to conventions and proudly shows his 22-foot, 2-way, parkable street, and he quotes this famous philosopher, who says, "Broad is the road that leads to destruction, narrow is the road that leads to life." This plays very well in the South, as you might imagine. So the ITE, goaded by the CNU, came out with this standard, which says travel lanes of 10 to 11 feet in cities. And what I find is that 10 feet is great everywhere. If you've got like a BRT, like a super important bus lane that's got a ton of buses, passing a ton of buses on a street in which there's only 2 lanes, then you might want the 11-foot measure so the mirrors don't hit. And then you've got a bunch of examples up here. In Lewiston, Sabattis, is that how you pronounce it? Sabattis Street, it's a 45-footer, which could be a 35-footer. And the standard is, 7.5, 10, 10, 7.5. 35 feet is all you need for a downtown street. So there's an extra 10 feet in there available for 2 bike lanes that you can stripe tomorrow. So I'm always just looking for the extra pavement to lay the stripes in, if for no other reason than to get the drivers to go slower, to narrow perceptually the driving lanes. And so here you have, here it is again. There's this odd, I'm not sure what this is this a skateboard lane? I don't know what this thing is. But there's room in this road for 5-foot lanes tomorrow. 4 Street, which I've renamed 45 Street because it's that wide and only needs to be 35 feet. So you look for these streets. Even lovely Camden, here's the measure. Camden has an extra 10 feet on US 1, and you can see it there between the cars and the parking. Room for bike lanes tomorrow. Bangor, US 2 is 50 feet. An extra 15 feet it's doing nothing. It's not increasing volume, it's only encouraging high speeds. Next, bicycles. Bicycling is the current biggest revolution currently underway in only some American cities. Portland is famous for spending $60 million over 30 years on bicycling. And in so doing, they went from biking just about the same as the rest of the country to biking 15 times as much as the rest of the country. And now almost half the kids in Portland either walk or bike to school, which is 5 times what it was 10 years ago. And they did it with bike lanes. I asked my friend Tom Brennan from Nelson Nygaard to send me some pictures of the bike commute in Portland. He sent me these. I said, was this bike to work day? He said, no, it's Tuesday. This is Tuesday in Portland, Oregon. What you get when you invest in the bike infrastructure. The gold standard now are these separated lanes, like you see in Chicago, where the parking is pulled off the curb so the bike lane is protected. Here in New York City, they did it on Prospect Park West. The number of cyclists, of course, number of cyclists, of course, tripled. Speeding dropped from 75% to 17% of all drivers. Injury crashes down 63% for all users. Car volume and trip times did not change. I have no idea why. They went from 3 lanes to 2, and it's no longer to get through the street on a car. So that's a great solution for your wider one-way streets. Cities ask, do we need to put the green paint down? You don't need to put the green paint down. But, oh, by the way, the greatest standard, I just learned this in Syracuse, New York, methacrylic. Sounds like a bad drug. Methacrylic is the system they're using that's lasted 2 winters and still holding up beautifully. The green paint is a horizontal billboard advertising your city as a place for people to come who care about health, who care about youth, who want to be in a hip place. So it's worth every penny. But if you believe instead that every lane is a bike lane, Pasadena doesn't do everything right. If you believe every lane is a bike lane, then no lane is a bike lane. This is the only cyclist I met in Pasadena. Because you've got to have those lanes to create biking in large numbers. And don't let the weather scare you. The number 3 mode share biking city in America is Minneapolis. Number 4, excuse me. Helsinki is doing great, thank you very much. And it's not a cult. And businesses understand, I discovered this 2 days ago, this is what I saw in Washington, D.C. We now have maid service using the bike lanes. It's fantastic. Companies understand, Denver tech companies, the number 1 thing they want is bike lanes, and you guys are doing it. So in Portland, Google's a little bit old. So I did find a bicyclist in Portland. I'm sure you've got some bike lanes there that I haven't seen yet. I did find this one in Lewiston, as I told you about. There's some right outside our hotel that are looking great. Do consider I'm sure you are considering the buffered bike lane. It's the buffered bike lane that gets people to go down in their basements and pull out their bikes after a decade of not using them, because it makes them feel safe and welcomed and celebrated as they bike around. And then in a place like Lewiston, where you have Bates up there at the top of this slide and the downtown down here, start thinking about how I'm sure you are already, thinking about how you can connect those anchors. Students are the most likely bikers. So when I work on a bike plan, I always do two things. I look at the number of where the anchors are and how to connect them, but I'm also just trying to use up extra pavement, irrelevant of how it works into the system. Just use up that extra pavement with bike lanes, and you guys are about to do a Lewiston Auburn multimodal plan with one of the best, Mike Lydon, my old colleague, and you're to be congratulated for that, and you've already accomplished a lot, so I have great hope for your cycling future here. The next element of safety is parallel parking. It's this essential barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. This is Fort Lauderdale. This is happy hour in Fort Lauderdale. Parking on one side, no parking allowed on the other side. This is the parked side of the street, and this is the unparked side of the street. Don't let anyone tell you you can have a good happy hour without parallel parking against the curb. You have a number of streets like US 1 in Rockland, or the very weird kind of wannabe Main Street in Freeport. Sorry, Freeport. And I know you're doing great because everyone comes to be at LL Bean, and you know, I've been there many times, and the Main Street isn't what it could be because it's missing the parallel parking and providing turn lanes and other things instead. Even one side of parallel parking would make this a real Main Street, more so than it is right now. And then the other part of this picture, the street trees. Who here heard Victor Dover's paean to the street tree last night? It was amazing. I wish I had recorded it. Street trees, I have a whole chapter just about street trees in my book. They're the most undervalued asset that most cities have. So important, and the latest studies show that in contrast to what we've been told for many years, that they were dangerous for drivers, that the trees actually slow cars down. Sometimes abruptly, but the final studies they've done have shown that there are fewer collisions on streets with trees than on streets without trees because they adjust the driver behavior. And then finally, you know, what's the vocabulary of the streetscape? This is what I call objective journalism. This is the Las Vegas Sun. It says, some say the entrance to City Center is not inviting to pedestrians. And the point is, you know, this is the failing addition to the Strip in Vegas. The point is that when you have stream-formed geometrics, aerodynamic shapes, anything swoopy, even like a roundabout, a modern roundabout with the pork chops coming into it, anything swoopy says this is a car place more than a people place. No matter how safe it actually is, it feels like a dynamic place, not a static place. So I always look for the swoops, and again here in this major intersection in Bangor, that's where the state engineers or the federal engineers get involved. Everything has to intersect at 90 degrees, unlike your historic intersections, and we'll swoop the streets in order to make that happen. A swoop tells a car to speed up, and it tells a pedestrian they're in an automotive environment. And just all the details, another Andres slide. We can't let specialists control the design of our city. Because yes, this street will be bone dry within 30 seconds of the 100-year flood. But what about the non-emergency condition that we face every single day? Signals? This is sculpture, this is not real. Well, it's real sculpture. We are over-signaled in America. And I learned something new about every year. I learned some new mind-blowing thing that I did not know anything about a year ago. And what I learned this year was the data on signals. Most of us who think about it know that we feel safer at a four-way stop than we do at a signalized intersection. And if you think about it, it's pretty clear why. Because every car stops at the intersection. No one ever goes through the intersection at more than 5 miles an hour or 10 miles an hour because they're stopping at the intersection. But the data is very clear. Philadelphia removed hundreds of signals, 472 of them, because the warrants changed, the rules changed. Data was collected on 199. Crashes went down 24%. Severe injury crashes were reduced 63%. Severe pedestrian injury crashes were reduced 68%. And this is funny. Traffic engineers in Philadelphia believe that the safety benefit stems from elimination of the local habit of speeding up to beat the red. Yeah, we're from Philadelphia, we speed up, right? I mean, everyone does it. And the point is, you know, a lot of the literature does not tell you this. And most people feel that traffic signals make places safer, but the four-way stop is the new roundabout. The four-way stop, the always stop, is the best, until we get to complete streets, until we get to the whole naked streets concept, not complete streets, naked streets, shared space, which I'm not going to talk to you about because most cities just aren't there yet. But there are proposals afoot in many American cities, and Portland is one of them, and the designer of it, Nir Burras, is here in the crowd, of a shared space concept for Portland, in which the street is actually a plaza, and there's no signs at all, and everyone's just milling around with everybody else. That's the safest solution, and it's starting to happen in America. But right now, you know, 2014, the new roundabout is the four-way stop sign. And so you have an intersection like this in Portland that isn't handling that many trips, that has a signal. Because it has the signal, it has the left-hand turn lane that you don't need at a four-way stop sign. So the road is wider than it needs to be. So here's a condition, of which you have many, I'm sure, where the signal is perhaps not warranted, and we should look into the reversion to the four-way stop. Here with great savings to the city, in Cedar Rapids, we're eliminating 11 of the 17 signals in the downtown. And wherever I work now, we're doing this, and I learned it a year ago. Okay, almost done, Kara, I'm about to finish. These two categories are very quick. The last two ones are the comfortable walk and the interesting walk. The comfortable walk is a little bit counterintuitive, because we Americans love our wide open spaces and our long views, but actually every creature, every animal, the evolutionary biologists tell us, every animal is simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge. We want to be able to see our prey and our predators, and we need to feel that our flanks are covered. And this is in your DNA after, you know, millennia of evolution. The reason we're all still here and alive is that we've developed certain traits that are in our bones that we can't fight. And one of them is we crave refuge, which is why the ratio of the height to the width of the space is absolutely essential. We new urbanists have been saying now that once you get beyond 6:1, you don't feel enclosed anymore. 1:6, this is Salzburg, can be a delight, even in a northern climate and a northern latitude. The opposite of Salzburg, of course, is Houston. I showed this slide in Austin and I got beat up. They said, oh, that slide's 20 years old. I said, okay, so I've added this slide. This is Houston now. And the point is that the main villain in this discussion is typically the surface parking lot, which erodes the street wall, makes the street wall go away. You all know, here's Damariscotta, you all know what a great street feels like. You know, the 1-to-1 ratio or close to it, or taller than the width. This is why people spend money to come and visit the old towns in Maine. In my visits in the past, it always felt a lot less comfortable and frankly a lot more windblown and frozen when you come down to Commercial Street at Portland's waterfront because of the large number of parking lots that you have on that edge. And then you have in the heart of downtown, by the beautiful art museum, you have probably the most important, tell me if it's being filled, but you have the most important block for pedestrian continuity in the city, perhaps, that has one of the few remaining surface parking lots in the city. In the absence of a building there, and then, you know, okay, it's wonderful to have a little green, but a green against a parking lot isn't worth a damn. One building right here, 60 feet deep, or one building on that edge, 60 feet deep, that'll completely change the experience of walking through downtown Portland. And then finally, well, it won't change it because it's already excellent, but it'll make it much more successful. Finally, the interesting walk. We humans are among the social primates. Nothing interests us more than other humans. We need to see evidence of human activity to be interested. This is an urbanist who said, this is just like 2 weeks ago, why don't people ever take their engagement photos in housing subdivisions? And so, this was the biggest thing on the web for about a day. But the answer is clear. It's not well shaped and it's boring. And this is the main street in Grand Rapids, a very walkable city that connects the two best hotels in Grand Rapids. The street does, but no one walks on this street because when one side of the street is an exposed parking facility and the other side of the street is a hotel conference center that was apparently designed in admiration for that parking facility, then no one will be interested. You Your horizontal lines are boring, vertical are much more interesting because things change as you move. Joe Riley in Charleston taught us it only takes 25 feet of building to hide 250 feet of garage. This is one in Miami, I call it the Chia Pet Garage. It's very successful. You have better examples and worse examples. You have 2 new parking lots within a 5-minute walk of this building that were not built with this knowledge in mind. And it's disappointing to see, if I can say that. Portland has the Elm Street example, which is articulated nicely, but it's dead space, basically clammy air coming through those grills. And then you have the better example on Temple Street, where it was done properly. And you actually have an occupied ground floor. But it's even better just to set the thing back 20 feet and have affordable row houses between the thing and the sidewalk. Then you've got a real edge that blocks the whole structure. So I like to end with this wonderful example. It's in Columbus, Ohio. The CNU gave it an award. I didn't work on it. None of the usual suspects worked on it. It was a local architect. It was really fantastic. And this is a state highway. Convention centers to that side, and the stadium is to that side. Lots of people walking. This is the short north. Struggling neighborhood, ethnic neighborhood, great restaurants, decent stores, and no one was walking from one part to the other. All the conventioneers, no one would cross the highway because there was this windswept bridge and this suicide screen. So no one was making that walk. Until when the state had to rebuild the bridge, the city gave the state an extra $1.9 million. They brought in the deck, they gave it to a developer who built this, and now there's a seamless, utterly seamless connection between the 2 neighborhoods. And the short north, if you read the newspaper articles, not the planning magazine, if you read the newspaper articles, it's this bridge that has brought back the short north to now being the hottest neighborhood in Columbus. So a brilliant $2 million invested. And the point here is that when you have walkability that's not far from walkability, and just a small gap in between, which could be a highway, or it could be, frankly, 3 Jiffy Lubes in between 2 things, that's the best investment for the buck when you bring them together. When you double the length of a pedestrian corridor, you quadruple the area, and quadruple, theoretically, the number of people walking. So, the final trick. That is the talk. This is the book. I look forward to seeing you at the book signing table. These are the other books if you're a real junkie. I invite you to my website. And then finally, I'm on Twitter, so my self-worth is a function of how many followers I have. So I hope you'll follow me at Jeff Speck, AICP. Finally, I give a course every summer at Harvard, very close to here, a 2-day course. It's not cheap, but you get a Harvard diploma out of it. So it's a really good deal. And I'll be giving it this summer, so if you stay in touch with me via my website or whatever, I'd love to have you come to the course this summer. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for the sponsors.